Good afternoon. This is Greg Core from OSEP's Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division. I'm glad you can join us this afternoon. We're going to be spending the next 45 minutes talking about our differentiated monitoring and support system. I hope you all had a chance to look at some of the pre-foundation work that was available last week and continues to be available at the conference website. I think that will give you some more detailed information on the topics that we're going to present today. But for those of you that haven't had a chance to take a look at that yet, we'll try to provide you enough information during our remarks today so that you can follow along. I have with me today Becca Wallawender, who is our Deputy Division Director, and she has been very involved in our restructuring here and the development of our differentiated monitoring and support system. Also, Matt Schneer, who has been equally involved and also happens to be the coordinator for our internal fiscal work group. Christine Pilgrim will be joining us shortly, and we have Jennifer Simpson here, who is also a work group facilitator, who's been working very closely with her work group around the development of our differentiated monitoring and support system. In my pre-recorded piece, I go into some detail on the origins and history of the development of differentiated monitoring in the context of RDA, results-driven accountability. So I'm not going to go through all that again now, assuming that most of you have had a chance to do that. But we have, just kind of in a nutshell here, we have moved significantly from a compliance-based system to one that places an appropriate emphasis on improving results while continuing to ensure that important compliance requirements are addressed by states. And this has been a 3.5 or so year process at this point. We realized last year, about midway through, that for us to really make this important shift to driving results, we needed to change the way we did our work. So we've done some significant restructuring, and that is also described in a video presentation. But we have, in summary here, moved to implementation teams, which are responsible for some of the key processes here in our office. We no longer have state contacts. We have instead state leads who have a very different role and function than the state contacts. We also are standing up state teams, which are composed of the state lead, but also representatives from each of our implementation teams to advise or to guide our work here with regard to a state's needs for monitoring and for technical assistance. One of the significant pieces of work that we've done over the last couple of years is revising our state performance plan, annual performance report document. We listened to states, and we have, wherever we could, eliminated burden and only including indicators that are specifically required by the statute. And again, and I apologize for kind of repeating information that's in our video, but we've also moved to a web-based platform, Grads 360, which automates the process both on the state end and on our end, facilitates a much more efficient exchange of information between us and the states. We have added a significant indicator Part B17 or Part C9 is the State Systemic Improvement Plan, a multi-year plan intended to describe states' work focusing on improvement in a performance area that it and its stakeholders select. And we have devoted significant amounts of our resources to assisting states with development of their SSIPs. Previously, our determinations under Section 616 had factored in only compliance information, and 2 years ago we began including performance information as well for Part B, and then last year for the first time for Part C. So again, we're trying to align our whole system of whether it be APRs, monitoring technical assistance to include performance information as well as compliance information. We have been supporting states on the development of Phase 2 of their SSIP through on-site visits, through virtual technical assistance, through conference calls. We've been working very closely in collaboration with our OSEP-funded TA centers who are providing assistance directly to states on the development of their Phase 2 SSIP. We developed an organizational assessment that we'll talk a little bit more about today, but that is posted on the conference website. It's a way that we will begin making decisions about our type and level of involvement as we support and monitor states' implementation of IDEA. As part of our new monitoring efforts, we also have special focus areas. And our first special focus area is going to be dispute resolution, and we released a dispute resolution self-assessment back at the end of last year. I spoke a little bit during the previous session this morning about our correctional education juvenile justice self-assessment, which will be the next special focus area that we'll be moving into. On my pre-recorded remarks, I indicated that that was saved and available on the conference website. I think I was a little bit too optimistic about the clearance process here. We are in the final stages of clearance for that, but it is not yet available, but should be available by mid-February, so stay tuned. We will be sharing that information with you as soon as we can release it. I wanted now then to turn the presentation over to Matt Schneer. Matt is going to be talking a bit about this organizational assessment.
Thank you, Greg. As Greg said, this is Matt Schneer. I am the coordinator or the facilitator of the fiscal implementation team, and I've also been working on the rollout of this new differentiated monitoring and support system. Wanted to take a few minutes to go over some of the most salient points from the video that I did on the organizational assessment, just to make sure everybody is up to speed. As Greg mentioned, the organizational assessment is a key way that we are utilizing to help make decisions about what type of monitoring and support each state needs. We are moving, as you know, from our old system, which was a one-size-fits-all cyclical system, to a differentiated monitoring and support system, looking at monitoring and technical assistance as part of a spectrum of support that we can provide. And what we're trying to do is make sure we are putting our resources, which are as limited as yours are, in the places that they're most needed. So in order to do that, we have a two-step process set up. The first part I'm going to speak about, which is the organizational assessment, is largely quantitative. And then the second part, which Becca will talk about a little bit more, the decision tree process, will take that quantitative information and use some additional qualitative information to help us make our final decisions. So the organizational assessment is essentially a process that we use to look at all of our grantees, all of our states, to determine what level of risk each of them may propose to in themselves, to help us decide what level of support that they need. And we do that by looking at 4 different areas. We have compliance, we have results, we have, as Greg mentioned, a special focus area, which this year is dispute resolution, and we have the fiscal area. And I'll talk about each of those very briefly in a moment, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the purpose of the assessment and the notion of assessing risk and what we mean by that. So the organizational assessment, or OA as I think we'll start calling it, is meant to help us identify the general and specific areas of concern related to a state's implementation of IDA, and then to use that to help inform the technical assistance and support that we will provide to states, both at the universal level and at the more specific level for each state, and then also inform the type of monitoring necessary to ensure that improvements are made in areas in which the risks are identified. Now, when we're talking about risk sounds like a pretty scary term, and sometimes people get taken aback by that. But I want to point out a few things. First of all, this process that we're going through is probably akin to something that you are already doing with your own sub-grantees or service providers, or something that you're contemplating doing, as it is required in the uniform guidance that all states perform a risk assessment. And so we think we're going through the same process that you are. And when we talk about risk, what we really mean is a measure of the likelihood of a grantee achieving overall program objectives, including financial reporting and compliance, within defined requirements related to statutes, regulations, and grant management practices. I think the most important thing to keep in mind here is that risk is not equal to either non-compliance or bad behavior. Risk may be a structural issue, such as having a large grant or a large number of school districts or local educational agencies, and that risk may either increase the likelihood of a problem occurring or the potential impact of that problem, what the impact of that problem being. So if you have a much larger grant and that you happen to fail, which we don't think any of you are, but if you did, that's going to have a much bigger impact overall. So that's the kind of calculus that we're looking at, and we expect doing something similar within your own states. So while risk sounds like a scary proposition, it's really a way for us to assess where we need to put our precious resources to make sure we're dealing with the most pressing problems first and the most potential impact first. So as we mentioned before, there are 4 areas within our organizational assessment, 4 different scoring rubrics. One is for results, and the second one is for compliance. Each of those utilize the matrices that we use for determinations as part of the APR process. And we've gotten feedback, and we understand that this data is somewhat old by now, but we thought it was important to use the same one measurement in 2 different processes for consistency's sake. We also, as Becca will make clear when we talk about the decision tree, have mechanisms for considering updated data beyond this, but this is just a starting place. And then the other 2 areas in our organizational assessment, we designed independent scoring rubrics for each of them, the dispute resolution and the fiscal scoring rubrics. On the website, you should be able to access some shots that show you how these work. Let me make clear that what's up there is not final. We're still tweaking it and working on out a few things, but it's pretty much what you should expect us to be using. So we wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like. There may be some final changes. You'll note that there's some color coding somewhere between green, yellow, and red, which we may or may not use. There are some scoring criteria that are given that we're still finalizing. But what I would ask you to focus on are not any of those things, but the basic nature of what it looks like and the areas that we're looking at, because those are pretty much set. So we think that this is going to be a great tool to help us focus our resources and get assistance and attention to the places that most need them. And I'm going to hand it over to Becca now, who's going to give you some more information about the next steps once we go through populating these scoring rubrics. Thank you, Becca.
Hey, good afternoon. There have been a couple questions that have come across the chat about no slides for Matt's presentation. We're working on getting something up right now. We don't have the information regarding the organizational assessment distilled into slides, so we're working off an Excel spreadsheet, and we're figuring out how to get that up right now. Well, we work on that, and we can also take you through, we'll take you through that information again once we get a visual up. I'm building on what other people have talked about, and this part of the presentation is really to put it into practice and have you see a picture of what this looks like. So we all know that what we focus on is what improves, and we realized in OSEP that we had a very broad focus area with all of our highly qualified staff looking across all of these areas. And we thought, as we did some internal evaluation of our processes, that it made more sense for us to focus in on the key, our key job functions that we're required to complete under IDEA, and really have staff that are able to go deep into every area. And so that led us to our reorganization. I'm going to, I apologize if this causes anybody a headache, but I'm going to kind of flip through these slides. Sorry, I'm pushing the button. I'm just waiting for it to advance. Okay, so what I want to take you through is how we see this system of differentiated monitoring and support playing out. The slide you see in front of you is how we visualize our system. As you'll see, along the side, you have the minimum components of RDA, and that's what we're calling the whole system now, is the Results-Driven Accountability System for Differentiated Monitoring and Support, or RDA. Our ultimate goal is to get to improved results through differentiated monitoring and support, but right now we are working on improving those results. We haven't finished anything, and so there's the difference in the endings of the words. We've determined that the minimum components for OSEP to address are performance accountability, which talks about results for students with for children with disabilities, which would include the infants, toddlers, and also children and youth with disabilities. And in that area, we're focusing on the results indicators, but most specifically the state systemic improvement plan. We have a majority of our resources, our human resources, allocated to the performance accountability area, because we see that as critical to ensuring both improved results for children with disabilities and full compliance with the law. Another area that we're focusing on is fiscal accountability, and that deals specifically with the money, with the grant you receive, and the systems you have in place to appropriately administer that grant. Then we have data accountability, and in this area we're focusing on the SPP-APR. That's our big data collection. We're drawing in data from other sources, including the CSPR, your 618 data collections, and then state reported data as well, and we have a team working specifically on data. Then we have program accountability, which focuses on the compliance aspects of the law. So it's broad compliance with the law, looking at all of the different requirements, but then, as Greg said, we're going to have a specific focus area that cycles through. So right now we're looking at dispute resolution. And each one of these areas are covered by an implementation team. So you see on our graphic, the implementation teams are represented by these little people, if you will. And so customer service is our foundational aspect, and we believe that customer service is your foundational aspect as well. We need to make sure that parents and our other constituents have the information they need so that they can make decisions that ultimately lead to their children receiving either early intervention services in the natural environment or FAPE in the least restrictive environment. So there's a basic level of customer service that you see in this slide that everybody receives from us and that presumably your constituents receive from you. Next, you'll see that we add in the program accountability. And as we're building on, and these are in no particular order, but as we're building our system up and through the depiction on this slide that tells the story, you'll notice that different states, whether they be A, B, C, D, or E, are receiving different levels of program accountability support. And again, this is our group that's focusing in more on the compliance areas of IDEA. We're determining the level of that support based on the organizational assessment, or the OA. And it's numbers-based, and so every state is not going to get the same level of support. It's based on individual need, or it's differentiated. Then we'll add on the layer of, then we add on fiscal accountability, and you'll notice there too. So the states, say state A is receiving the customer service support, their program accountability support isn't as intensive as their fiscal accountability support in this graphic. Whereas if we look at the last state, and I'm sorry, the slide is small and I can't, it's A, B, C, D, E, F. State F, they receive the standard level of customer service support. They are receiving increased program accountability support because the organizational assessment has identified an increased need in that area, but their fiscal support isn't as, the fiscal support needed isn't as great. One person asked in the chat if we would be providing different levels of support in each of the areas. It very well could be that a state is getting universal technical assistance for their program accountability, but then their fiscal accountability, they're receiving intensive technical assistance. So it could be that you have different levels of support based on the accountability component. I'm going to move through this next slide without any words, and then I'm going to add on the last piece. So here you see our whole story, telling our whole story. We have a series of states across the bottom. When we first built this picture slide, we had a number of states, and it got way too busy. Obviously, this is just a representation and doesn't represent that we'll only work with E number or E letter of states. We will work with our 116 grantees on an annual basis. And you'll notice that we're providing different levels of support in the different areas based on the outcome of the organizational assessment. Sorry, I'm just going through the slide. And again, we believe that providing this differentiated monitoring and support will allow states to reach that goal of improving outcomes for children with disabilities. Greg talked a little bit about the state team, and now I hope this makes more sense since you've heard about how we're organized, how we're allocating our resources. So it used to be that you had a state contact, and your state contact was the person that you dealt with. They worked behind the scenes to get you the answer, and then you spoke with them. In our new organizational structure, you'll still have that primary point of contact. We're calling that person the state lead. However, it's not the state lead's responsibility to provide all of the information in a comprehensive manner. We found that that was just spreading people too thin and wasn't allowing our staff to become as deeply knowledgeable about the particular topics as we needed them to be, and as the states need our staff to be in order to ensure improving outcomes for children with disabilities. So your state lead is still your primary point of contact. However, you're going to be supported by a team of people. So you'll have a fiscal expert that's specifically assigned to your state, an expert in the MSIP, an expert in data in the SPP APR, an expert in the program accountability or the special focus area we're on. And then, as always, you have a customer service representative assigned to your team. The associate division director still plays a key role in supporting the states, but now more as a coach and an advisor, and so really working on this idea of providing holistic wraparound support to states with experts in every area. Sorry, I'm advancing. Let me see where I am on this slide. When Matt was talking about the organizational assessment, he talked about, and I'm not sure if there's something that the technology people can do to advance my slides. I'm having a difficult time doing it.
Craig, can you advance the slide for us, please?
Right, well, as the slide is coming up, let me just continue talking. Matt, as he was rolling out the organizational assessment, he said that I would begin to explain this idea that nothing is based on hard numbers. It's important that we start with a quantitative factor because we know that we can make decisions based on data, and data gives us numbers. But also there are qualitative data, and those data are incredibly important in deciding the ultimate and final recommendation for the level of monitoring and technical assistance that we provide to each state under the results-driven accountability system for differentiated monitoring and support. We're trying to get that visual up for you now. If you're looking at your conference resources, we also have posted this slide deck. And so I am on slide 11. So continuing to talk through it and hoping that you were able to pull up the information from the conference website, we're going to start with where we get our hard numbers from. The first thing that we're going to fill in when we're making our ultimate decision on this engagement decision tree is we're going to start with a number for everything but the MSIP. For the results and compliance areas that Matt talked to you about, we're going to start with a determination matrix percentage. And we'll take it from the year for which we have the most recent data available. So this is what this is the number that you get in your determination letter each year. And then we want to, though, figure out what are the other factors that come into play. What do we know exists behind this number? So and I'm going to, actually, if you can move my slides and move them to slide 12, that would be really helpful. Yeah. And somehow I don't see that. Do I just need to refresh? Okay. Okay, so when we look at this, and this is just an example, this is a results line pulled out of the decision tree. You would have something that looks just like this for compliance, for fiscal, for the special focus area, and then for the MSIP. And so we start with that determination matrix percentage, and here we see that it's solidly green. We all know in our vernacular, colors have meaning, and green meets requirements. But we want to look at what's behind that information. And behind that information, we see that we have other factors that may contribute to elevated risk. And so in this example, this is state ABC. It's totally made up. The state had low scores on the NAEP in 8th grade, and no data were submitted. Now, we know that they're accessing TA. This is another factor that's critically important. So they're working with a TA provider. They also have engagement with NCSI. We also want to look at the state's capacity to improve results. So we know that the state has stable leadership at both the chief level and the state director level. They're working collaboratively with their title programs in the state, and they're actively engaged in improvement activities. We also want to consider things that don't fall neatly into any of those boxes, and so that's the additional data needed. When we looked at the factors that may contribute to elevated risk, we noted that there were no data submitted. However, we also know that the data weren't submitted because there was a data breach. So there's a logical and real explanation for why this happened. And their SIMR is, and so for those of you who don't speak in our acronyms yet, that is the State Identified Measurable Result, which is what you're measuring in the State Systemic Improvement Plan, or the MSIP. We also know that their SIMR is tied to reading, which brings you back to the low scores on the NAEP and 8th grade reading. So based on all of this information that we have available, we would recommend that the state receive universal technical assistance in the area of results. And then we will record the reasons why this is. So we have a green score, they're addressing the concerns raised in the decision tree, and there's the infrastructure to continue to carry out and sustain the work. All right, so the next thing we have is a state that, again, in our parlance, is red or needs intervention. This is state XYZ. Taken from their most recent determination matrix percentage, it's a 20. We know that the factors are poor NAEP and statewide assessment scores, and the state has decided not to accept any outside TA. They don't have systems at the state level that have been determined to produce valid and reliable results. There's significant leadership turnover. They have a high number of LEAs, poor funding, lack of staff. One thing that we do know, though, is that they're doing really well with inclusion rates on some assessments. And based on all of this information, we would recommend that there would be intensive technical assistance and support in the results area, but we're going to have to be creative about what we deliver and how we deliver so that we're respectful of what the state's accomplishing, but then also being mindful that it seems clear that the state requires additional support. So the last one is a state that we would based on the determination matrix percentage, would be needs assistance. They have poor NAEP scores and statewide participation rates. That word is key. Pay attention to that as we go on. They are working with NCSI and IDC, but they're working on data quality. They have a small staff. Their chief just left. Another thing we know is their SIMR isn't aligned to the elevated risk factor. Remember that the risk factor is the poor participation rates. And we know that they have an issue in this state LMNOP, with access to the general curriculum. So we assume that's why their participation rates are down. So even though this state is solidly needs assistance, our final recommendation might be that they need intensive support. Our concern is that they're not addressing the critical issue of participation. And then another factor that we know is that the state director has specifically asked that we come because there is a new chief, and this new chief is very committed to addressing issues with kids with disabilities, and we want to keep the information moving. I'll move the slide along. And to answer the question that just came up, is there a rubric example specific to Part C? There isn't for the purposes of this presentation, but we can absolutely do that and get it out. The topics covered will be the same. Okay, so because it's differentiated, we want to talk about the different levels and types of engagement. We're defining levels of engagement as either being universal, targeted, or intensive. Very basically, universal is provided to all states. The universal technical assistance might be this conference. Universal Technical Assistance is our monthly calls, FAQs that we distribute broadly. Could be responses to policy letters, dear colleague letters. So things that we're distributing widely to states on issues that are specific to IDEA. Targeted technical assistance is when we identify a specific issue, but it's very limited in time and in scope. Now, targeted technical assistance could be provided to one state, or it could be provided to a small group of states that all have the same issue. And perhaps we come together and form a community of practice, or we bring states together for a 2-hour virtual meeting where we have experts in the area presenting. Then intensive technical assistance is really talking, monitoring and technical assistance is talking about addressing systemic issues. These are deep-seated issues that are going to take a while to resolve. It would be an appropriate level of support to give a 2-hour webinar, but then there's going to need to be extensive follow-up. I want to make sure that people don't confuse our level of engagement with the methodology. Therefore, intensive technical assistance is not always going to be on-site. It might not be the most appropriate way to deliver that technical assistance. In the past, I think our OSEP's monitoring has always been associated with a cyclical on-site activity. Now we're talking about working year-round and providing technical assistance and monitoring using different methods. And that will get me to the different types of engagement. So we have monitoring and technical assistance, and then we can divide it into either virtual or on-site. And you'll notice that we provide examples of each. I think that pretty deeply covers our new organization, the areas in which we're organized. We received a question prior to the conference that asked if states were required to organize themselves in this way. The answer is absolutely not. OSEP, after a thorough evaluation of our processes and procedures, determined that this was the best way to organize MSIP to meet our obligations under Section 616 of IDEA. States also have obligations under IDEA and specifically 616 to ensure that their systems are in place to make sure that kids are getting either early intervention in the least restrictive environment or a free appropriate public education. Early intervention in the natural environment or a free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And if the state, after a similar evaluation, determines that they want to work in functional work groups, then that would be an appropriate decision for a state to make. However, if a state determines that that's not how they want to organize, there's no requirement that states undertake the same task. Kind of lost my words. So I think it's time to turn it over to all questions, maybe?
Yeah, I think we have a few, and that was a lot of information to digest, as some of our audience members have commented on. So I would urge you to go back and look at some of the pre-recorded information, as well as the slides and other resources that we have posted. But some of the big takeaways are that organizational risk is not the same as non-compliance. It does not communicate bad behavior on the state's part. We are using the organizational assessment to help us make our decisions, our internal decisions, about how we best deploy our resources. And I know that's a difficult concept to embrace, but if we're going to differentiate, we need a data-based way to do that. And we are using our organizational assessments and our rubrics to guide our decision-making process here. The numbers that Becca was talking about for each of the rubrics are not determinative. They are just a starting point. So if you have a particular number on your physical organizational assessment, that's kind of where we begin. But then we begin asking some more detailed questions about the state's, what's driving those numbers, about the state's capacity to improve, et cetera, before we make any final decisions about monitoring and technical assistance. And I'm getting the 5-minute warning here. And that where did all this come from? Well, we're not totally making this up out of thin air. There are, I believe Matt referred to the uniform guidance, which applies not only to federal agencies like OSIP, but also applies to states in terms of managing their grantees. The uniform guidance calls for a risk-based approach to ensuring compliance and supporting improved performance for grantees. It also requires, I was going to say encourages, but I think it's stronger than that, requires that we at the federal level and that states use a differentiated approach as the best way to allocate resources to ensure compliance and drive improvement. So the work that we're doing, in addition to supporting RDA, is also consistent with the overall approach that the department is taking through the uniform guidance. There were a couple questions that came in that I want to try to answer before our time is up. One was, are all the rubrics available or just the fiscal? We have the fiscal posted and also the dispute resolution rubric. For compliance and for results, we are relying significantly on the determination matrices, which you received in June of 2015. Again, those numbers will be just a starting point. There's nothing automatic about that at all, but that's kind of how we begin the conversation about how we should be engaged with your state. Another question came in, when will states be notified of their level of risk and any associated monitoring and support activities that OSIP will be engaged in? What we need to do to get to that point is we are populating each of the rubrics with state-specific information. We are convening our state teams that Becca talked about a few minutes ago, and deploying the decision matrix for each state, and then reaching some decisions about how we will engage with the state. We're anticipating that we'll be able to get back to states sometime in April or May, maybe even faster, but I'm trying to be conservative here about those decisions and how we'll be engaged with you.
Can I just do two? There are some quick one-offs that we can answer. Regarding poor participation rates and Part C child outcomes, I don't think that that's a factor that we would consider. The example that we were presenting in the slides was very specific to Part B indicator B3, which has a requirement for participation rates. So that's why we were considering it. So it's not applicable to Part C, and we wouldn't do that. The determination matrix percentages are individual. So we're using the results percentage and then the compliance percentage. If I had had a little more time, I would have walked you through everything. But if you take that determination matrix percentage score, for results, it would be specifically results. For compliance, compliance. For fiscal, it's taken from the organizational assessment. And for program, it's also taken from the organizational assessment for the specific area. If a state could potentially have intensive monitoring in each of the 5 areas, shouldn't there be a rubric that delineates them clearly? There actually, okay, there's 1 minute and it's a hard stop. This is something that we'll talk about, and maybe we should schedule another call. But we're not going to do that. We're going to take into account our capacity and the state's capacity to receive technical assistance. And there is a decision that comes out of the engagement decision tree. So I'll leave it at that, and I think we have 30 seconds for Greg.
Okay, good. I'll try and squeeze my message into the next 30 seconds. Thank you. We appreciate all 400 plus of you who are on this call listening to us. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And I want to remind you to log back in tomorrow at 11:30 for our next live session, and the topic will be, I'm looking at early childhood. Okay, so please be sure that you access that live session. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.